Thank you, brethren, and thanks for having me back because we really have some things to talk about at this time as we get into this sermon mode. We spoke about the great time we had at the feast, and that really we all agree. And it is such a great feeling when you can go away from all of what we had to go away from, get steeped into the word, and to be able to come back enriched. But alas, one of the most dangerous times in the life of the believer is that moments when we gain a spiritual high. We have gone to that point where we feel we have really met the Lord face to face. And we come back into Babylon. On many times, many events feeling strong. 8 consecutive days of prayer, of rich sermons and music and all the prayers and the fellowship and the baptisms that took place and all the activities that take place and so on. You come back really a person with a different focus, a different mind, or let's put it away, a stronger focus, a stronger mind in terms of your Christian walk. But alas, this joyous, great feeling, this victorious feeling has another side to it. Because sometimes we feel so enriched. And follow me. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's not that you have any intention of doing anything wrong. It's just that you come back feeling so strong. You believe you have enough strength to carry you. You feel you've prayed so much, you don't have to bother. You can back off a little bit of the prayer now. Because you have done so well at the feast. You feel that you spend so much time focusing upon God and His kingdom and the hope of the world tomorrow, that you say, it's time for me to get a little relaxation. To take a break, my brother here say, and to be able to sort of catch up with things, because a lot of things would have been happening while you were at the feast, that you piling up, the work and all that. You get back to the job, and the boss is now putting a load of things on you, because you are the one who took the decision that you wanted to go away. Now that you come back, see what you get now. See what you get. It's like a revenge they want to take on you and all that kind of thing. And there's a thing called complacency that sets in, and we just don't know where it comes from. Because you feel a little weary, you feel a little tired, you feel a little need to slow down, and you begin to do that. And it begins to take hold on us. And this is something that has happened to persons with experience going to the feast, coming back. Will find that they have to now put that aside and get on with other things, right? Because things are kind of getting a little bit out of hand. But we are not the only ones who really have had great feasts. And I wanted to sort of take you to the scriptures to show it to you a little bit about, if you turn to the book of Nehemiah, and you go first of all to chapter 6. And this is the time when Nehemiah and the Israelites, the Jews who were in captivity, got a release to go back into Jerusalem. And they decided that they were going to build this wall. And you'll remember how well they built the wall. I think it was in 52 days or 52, something like that. They completed it because of a particular management system that Nehemiah employed. They were able in record time. And by the time they were finished building the wall, it was now the month of Elul, E-L-U-L, I think it is spelled. And that is the month before Tishri. So Elul will fall, say, between the months of August into September. Tishri is September into October. So it was coming up to the time of the fall festival season. So that was what was happening to them. Now go over to chapter 7, because what I just described for you is what you'd have seen in chapter 6, verse 15 and onward. But go to chapter 7, and if you look at verses 1 to 3, well, you look at verse 7 to 3 in chapter 7 to begin with. Verse 7 to 3 in chapter 7. You will see there where it says, all the people gathered as one man in the open square. And that is going into chapter 8 and verse 1. So chapter 7 to 3 spills over into chapter 8 verse 1. All the people came together as one in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. And then notice in verse 2 it says, so on the first day of the 7th month, that would have been the day of trumpets, right? Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. That's what the assembly was made up of. And he read it aloud from daybreak till noon, as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men and women. And it shows you that they were just reading the scriptures and how they were enjoying it and so on. Step down to verse 7. It shows you a number of them. Joshua, Benai, Sherebiah, if I can pronounce the names, Jamin, Akub, and a number of them together. They instructed the people in the law while the people were standing there. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear. This was real deep study, because this was for a long time, Israel never had this kind of teaching and knowledge. So they made it clear and giving the meaning so that people understood what was being read. And that is also, this is a very good example of, preaching at God's festivals. This was trumpets. But, preaching at God's festivals, how much we are required to do work ahead of time in order to be able to help those who are listening to get it clear, to understand very clearly what is being said and what is being done. And then something happens. Something majestic, if you may, happens. Go down to verse 14 and into 17. They found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded through Moses, that the Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month. So they are here in the Feast of Trumpets, and they are now learning Amazing, isn't it? Amazing how people who were keeping these feasts for so long, that there would come a break in their life where a whole generation would have lost hold. So they founded the law that they were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim the word and spread it through their towns and in Jerusalem. And it says, go out into the town, into the hill country, and bring back branches from olive and wild olive trees, and from myrtles and palms and shade trees, to make temporary shelters. So this is something that they're going to now return to, which they had for some time apparently abandoned. Verse 16. So the people went out and brought back branches, and they built themselves temporary shelters on their own roofs, in their courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, and in the square of the water gate, and the one of the gate Ephraim. The whole company that had returned from exile built temporary shelters and lived in them, from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, till that day the Israelites had not celebrated the feast. And this is something, a discovery, that the people of God, these were the people of God, but they went astray. They were in exile. And when you're in exile, you get caught up with your new land, your new homeland, if you may. And for that reason, you tend to go astray. And this is really a lesson for you and me who are in the church. That there are many today who used to keep the feast that are not keeping it. And the reason they're not keeping it is because by living in Babylon, they have learned that it is no longer necessary. That God is not a legalist. That God will understand because you're in Babylon, so you don't have to bother about it. Just do what the Babylonians do, because your God is still with you. Those kinds of luring and arguments. And verse 17 says, and this is an important point, and there was very great gladness. They found something. They found a pearl of great price. They found something that was a treasure hidden away, lost from them. And they said, boy, we found it. And for that reason, they went ahead. They had the feast. They were able to have a joyous time. They went to the feast and they learned. They went to the feast and they were uplifted. They were enlightened because they found this truth in the scriptures. So what did they do? What did they do at the end of the feast? What did they do when the feast was over? Is it that they went back and all they were doing is saying, boy, we had a great feast, and it was wonderful, and boy, you weren't there? Oh boy, I'm sorry. Well, I'm sure in Israel, maybe everybody turned up there. It's a community. They were acting as a community. But certainly, what we're comparing here today is to show, what do you do after a great feast? When you have a great feast, and all of the things that were so improved, what do you do with it? How are you going to respond to it? Go to chapter 9. Chapter 9 and verse 1 said that on the 24th day of the month, you know when that is? That is after the feast finish. There's a reason that the date is there. On on the 24th day of the month. They would have already gone through from the 15th of the month up to the last great day. And this was now the 24th of the month. And what were they doing? The children of Israel were assembled with fasting, in sackcloth and dust on their heads. Although they had a great feast, they realized that what had happened to them in the past, where they had lost their way, could happen to them again. And they were committed, compelled, they were resolved that this will not happen again. And the fact that they had a great feast, for them, it's time to work. It's time for us to get back and to be able to get enriched. And the first thing they did was get into fasting. Many people believe that fasting is only for the day of atonement. But that is not so. The Day of Atonement is there to teach us that fasting is a critical and important part of our spiritual walk. And therefore, it is one of the feasts that teaches us that we need to fast. They got back. Can you imagine these people coming from the feast? And what they decided to do was to get into fasting. That is just 2 days after the feast. And they're back into a spiritual exercise. And that is an important point that we need to consider. After the feast, how are we programmed? How are we impacted? What have we planned as our next steps? What is it that we are going to do individually and collectively as a people? Look at verse 2. Nehemiah 9 and verse 2. Then those of Israelites' lineage, look at this, separated themselves from all foreign. Oh my goodness, no, this is getting bad. It's getting deep now. They learned at the feast that Israel was not supposed to be mixing in marriage with people who were of pagan practice, pagan origin. And having learned it, they came back to practice what they learned. They came back in order to practice what they learned. That is a response to the feast. The feast is a resource. It gives us, it equips us, is a period, a concentrated period, a focused period in which God allows us to be recharged, to be refreshed, to be reminded. But after the feast is a period for practice, is a period of executing, implementing, and doing the things that we learned at the feast. The lineage separated themselves from all foreigners, dissolving their marriages with pagan mates. That's what it is. And they stood and confessed their sins and their iniquities of their fathers. So there was impact. The feast had an impact on them. And in our case, each one of us would know the things that we heard that made an impact, that caught our attention. These people face the same test as we face today. They are not people with stronger bones and greater veins in their bodies and, no, these are very, very people like you and me. And why is it written in the scriptures? To show us how they responded to the feast. These things were written for those of us upon whom the end of the age has come. It's as an example. But I believe that this example of them breaking up their marriage is there to show us the extent to which we need to go in the process of correcting our lives. I think this is there as to show us that this is not just a matter of, I think I remember this and I remember that, and it is all a mental exercise. It is living out the things that were taught. And this is why it's important when you do, whether it's at the feast or it's at the Sabbath services, when sermons are preached and when Bible studies are done, that you get in and make sure for yourself that the things you're hearing are indeed what God wants of you. Because it is important, after hearing them, that you and I would now turn around and do them. Turn over to chapter 13 and verse 24, same Nehemiah. One of the problems of them being in the condition where they had lost contact with God and lost contact with the Word and lost contact with the law was because they were steeped in the pagan culture. Look at what Nehemiah 13:24 said. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod. That's a Philistine city. Half of their children, that's the language they spoke, and could not speak the language of Judah. So very likely they could not even read the scrolls, or they're not necessarily ones who had copies of the scrolls, but they would not have been able to relate to a lot of the things that were being taught in Israel because of the fact that their culture had changed. Our culture in which we live is changing very rapidly. And a lot of the things that are happening to us nowadays, it teaches us a lot about the spiritual world. Some time ago, there were times when you would talk about, I pray to the Lord and say, so where was the Lord? How you know that he heard you? Is that here? Is that this? Maybe not. Nowadays, that you have cell phone, and you yourself are talking to people thousands of miles away, just like that, very easily. I see people walking in the supermarket or walking on the street, and you can no longer say this person is mad, because first time when you see people talking to themselves, you say he's a madman, but it's as though they're talking to themselves, but they're talking with people, they're in touch with people all over. Nowadays our technology teaches us that the things which God has taught us are so real. I have learned, for example, that in the world that we live, what is called cyber warfare, and some of you would know because especially you young people, you're very bright when it comes to the technological changes and shifts because you're actually using them. Cyber warfare is so powerful, so strong, that people are now able to enter equipment that are being made. Just equipment. It doesn't have to be anymore a computer or cell phone. It can be just your toaster or very little gadgets in your home. And many of these gadgets are so programmed that the manufacturers know where they are. They know where they are. There are chips that can tell you where, if this thing is lost, where it is. A young man walked in to Flo, where I was a few days ago. And he came in, his problem was that he's calling his car. And the thing is not answering, his car is not answering. Because there is a chip that they put in the car that once he calls, it replies and say where it is. The car tells him where it is. And he says it is so programmed on his phone that if he wants to just shut it down, he just shuts down the car. So if somebody stole his car, he's capable of doing that. These kinds of things that we are seeing in the scriptures are amazing because they are teaching us that the spiritual things that God has taught us about are real. And when we are in a world like the one we are no longer, we're pretty much at the mercies. If God were not with us, if his angels were not encamping around us, we would be drawn and dragged into Satan's world in very, very significant ways. And so what they did, they went into repentance. They went into repentance. Now, is it true that you and I are so good Christians that we have no repentance to do? Is it true? Is it true? No, it's not true. It's not true. I know it's not true for me. I know that I am by default carnal. By default carnal. It is an effort to be spiritual, to work against the carnality of my mind, the carnality of my body, the carnality of my desires. And you and I are going to have to see how are we using. Was the feast wasted? Was it a waste? That you go there and you hear a lot of good things and so on, but unless we actually implement these things, then we are working against our own interest. They went into prayer, and it says here, verse 2, those of Israelite descent had separated from themselves from all foreigners. They stood in their places and confessed their sins and the sins of their ancestors. They stood there where they were and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a quarter of the day and spent another quarter in confession and in worshiping the Lord their God. All of this. And they prayed in verse 5. It says, blessed be your glorious name, and may it be exalted above all blessings and praise. You alone are God. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. And then in verse 32, step down, it says, now therefore, our God, the great God, mighty and awesome, who keeps his covenant of love, do not let all this hardship seem trifling in your eyes. The hardship that has come upon us, on our kings and our leaders and our priests and our prophets and our ancestors and all our people from the days of the kings of Assyria until this day. They're praying for their people, their nation. They're praying for the priests, because even the priests had lost their way. They're praying for their families, for their children, and everyone in their lineage. And they're calling it hardship. Can you imagine? That's not what we call hardship. We call hardship when we don't have the money. Hardship is when we're not able to get the physical things. They are calling the violation of God's law the hardship. And they know why. They know why more than we know. Because they would have been closer to understanding the penalty, the hardship that God puts upon them when they break his law. But you know, we don't really think that way. We look at breaking God's law as sin, but we don't look at the consequences. We don't look at the consequences. And to know that much of the hardships that we go through can come from our refusal to keep the laws of God. And they prayed very hard. If you read it for yourself and go up to verse 36. Step over to chapter 10, Nehemiah 10. It says here, the rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the Lord, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey. In other words, they made a resolution. They made a resolution. So after they have discovered their sins, after they applied and obeyed the things that they learned, then they came to a point where they made a resolution with God. This is what really happens after a great feast. Because that was a great feast. That feast was an eye-opener for them. That was a feast in which they were taught things that were lost in Israel. But they didn't just look at it as enlightenment. They didn't just look at it as making them brighter. They didn't just look at it and say, boy, you know what I learned today? And they go on and they're showing people and showing off what they know. That's not what they did with it. What they did with it was to say, I must use this to change my life and to change the way in which I have been living. Verse 30, they're now making a pledge. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us, or take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every seventh year, we will, in other words, what they're doing, they're going through the law that was taught to them, that was opened up to them. And all of the things that they were taught, they're saying, no, this is what we are going to do. They didn't take the feast and say, boy, it was a wonderful feast. What a man like Ezra, man. The man kept preaching. They didn't go home. That's not how they treated it. Nehemiah, boy, I tell you, man, those guys, good guys, and so on, and you know, that's not really what made it a great feast for them. What made it a great feast was the way in which it was life transforming, how it could transform their lives. And I'd like for us to really reflect on how the feast impacted you. How the prayer meetings, how the sermons, how the songs, how the various things, the fellowship, and all the various things that you did. You can read it on your own. But what it is saying here is that they all came to a conclusion and they resolved that they were going to have some changed lives. Life was not going to be the same for them. And this is really what you can call restored commitment. After the feast is a time when you can recommit yourselves to God. It is a time, remember, the feast is a crescendo. It starts Passover and you come through unleavened bread and you come through, and when you come to the Feast of Tabernacles and last great day, it is kind of the culmination of things. And therefore you've completed a whole chapter, a whole year. And your duty, your response is that you didn't go to the feast just to enjoy it. You go to the feast in order to be equipped for transformation, to equip your life so that you can be transformed. So the excitement which we come away with from the feast is a great thing. But what are we doing with it? And how are we going to put it into effect? What we are seeing here from the example is that first thing was they went into a fast, which was a sort of emptying themselves and drawing closer to their Creator. What they did was to gather their families around and make a renewed covenant to fear God. They got everybody in the family to agree. What they did was to commit. How to commit? And what is the way in which we can commit? How we are going to walk in the Spirit of God. How we are going to have a changed life. How we are not going to be the same. How it is that I'm going to be moving 1 notch, 2 notch, 3 notches higher on the spiritual ladder. Through fasting, through prayer, through study, through change of my habits. Because if you went to the feast and came back with some bad habits that you had gone with, if you come back with the bad habits, you did not. Don't kid yourself. You have not really had a good feast. A good feast means that it has brought change, and you and I have that as an example for us to do. And why am I bringing all of this to your attention? I'm bringing it to our attention because spiritual readiness is something that each of us as believers is going to have to make a preoccupation in our minds. One of the dangers of the Christian life is that we tend to speak about the coming of Christ in terms of future. And we see it as an event, and that we are going to be there when He comes. But another view to have, that is true, that it is future, the coming of Christ is future. But another view to have is to see the coming of Christ, because we always say, will Christ come tomorrow? Will Christ come tonight? But what I want to warn you is that in your life and my life, Christ can come tonight. Oh, yes. Christ for you. Christ for me. Although we know the prophecy, what that can really be is that it is in my life because of the fact that I am vulnerable. I can die at any moment. And when I say I can die at any moment, I'm not speaking only because of age. I'm speaking because even an infant can die at any moment because of what life is like and what life is about. Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 24:37. He speaks about the days of Noah. And he speaks about it will be very much like the Son of Man, when the Son of Man will come. And then later on in verse 42, he says, "Watch therefore," which means we must stay alert. But that alert is not simply for the actual coming of Christ. It is an alert for the fulfillment of the coming of Christ in your life and my life. The fulfillment of it in my life will be at a point if I die before Christ comes. That means that's it. And you do not know the day of the Lord's coming. I wanted to read it in that way. You do not know the day when the fulfillment of the coming of Christ in your life is fulfilled. And there's something I want to point to you that I brought out in another place, which was very, very striking when I came upon it in the scriptures. And that is, God teaches us so many things, not only explicitly, but implicitly, that if we are not diligent in searching His Word, we miss a lot. Because something that's came out very clearly recently, as I was doing some studies for the Feast of Trumpets, is how God has actually built into the Feast of Trumpets a message of urgency, a message that says to us that you have no time at all left. And that is built in because of the date of the Feast of Trumpets. Do you realize that the Feast of Trumpets is unique in one of the senses in which it is unique is that it's the only feast that falls on the first of the month. Whether you're thinking about Nisan or you're thinking about Tishri or Sivan. It is the date that God has been set for it to come at the first of the month. And it is very interesting when you probe and you discover that historically, the way in which the Israelites would have known when the feasts would begin is at the time of the new moon, when you had the sliver coming out. And the way in which they discovered it is that they had to go out into the hills to watch it. And when they shall have seen it, they would come back to the Sanhedrin to report it, in order that they can now announce it to tell the people when the feast will begin. In the case of Nisan, like with Feast of Unleavened Bread and so on, you know that High Holy Day begins on the 15th. So you have 2 weeks after you discover that the month has begun to prepare for that. In the case of Tabernacles, you have 2 weeks again, because it begins on the 15th of the month. The funny thing about the Feast of Trumpets, the funny thing about it is that at the very moment that they see the sliver, it is time for them to already be in the temple for worship. No time to prepare. No time at all. You have to be there readily, right away. So as they come and they say, bam, the sliver is there. Wow, we all have to be in worship. No time to prepare. God has built it in to the very date of the time of trumpets, which is there to symbolize the coming of Christ. And that is, for me, a great confirmation of the urgency of the coming of Christ in our lives. As far as Moses is concerned, Christ has already come for him. All the people in the book of Hebrews who have died, Christ has already come for them. In that sense. Because it is the condition that at that point, everything was finished. There's no repentance in the grave. And there's no sin either. You can't do anything. There's no repentance and there's no sin. So you are very much there. So God has really taught us in different ways. He tells us explicitly, he tells us implicitly, he gives us examples, he gives us feasts, he gives us practical things to teach us. And it really is critical. So what must we do? What does it tell us? It tells us that what Jesus says in Matthew 24:12 is going to have to come home to us a little bit closer. We're going to have to take it a little more serious. It is okay to talk about the coming of Christ, and that when he comes, the seventh trumpet, and the dead in Christ shall rise first, and is good. It's good. It's good to know all of that. But we're going to have to be very personal and to say, you know what? The coming of Christ in my life can be at any time when I am no longer. I've died. Therefore, verse 4:2, watch, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Let us look at that in another eye. Watch, therefore, you do not know on what day you're going to die. You don't know when. So therefore, the readiness and the watching is very urgent in your life. Don't joke. Don't joke with this. Don't joke with this. I've seen very healthy people. Very healthy people. In fact, most of the killings and so on that are taking place around the place, but many of them are happening because of accidents, because of people attacking others, and all kind of things are happening. Lots of it. It's not because people are sick and you get warning and say, boy, you're sick, and the doctor tell you that you have only so many days or so many months to live, and then you start preparing. That's not it. That's not the norm. That is very unusual. The norm is that people just die. And we are going to have to take it into consideration. Verse 43. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, if we knew in that part of the night what time the death was coming on us, we would have prepared. We would have prepared. Because many deaths take place in sleep, while people are asleep. So, whilst we must understand the biblical teaching about the coming of Christ, in the sense of the future coming of Christ, it must not in any way blind our eyes to the reality. So what does Christ say? Therefore, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Your death is coming at an hour you do not expect. My death is coming at an hour I do not expect. We have had one of the most tragic loss in the passing of our pastor, Pastor Ian Boyne. And when it happened, after I came here in December and visited with him in the hospital, because it was the message I got was that this was the last. And went back there and went and saw him, and he was chirping. He was chirping. We had a good talk. We spoke about so many things in the hospital. And he was looking forward to getting out of the hospital. I couldn't believe it when somebody said to me that Pastor Boyne has died. I said, no. I was in Jamaica. He actually was in a very, very bad state, but thank God he's okay. He said, no, Pastor Boyne died. So I thought, well, you're crazy, because, I just came back a couple of weeks, and I saw the man, and he was in strict recovery and so on. And then just to find out that it was true. Just couldn't. And he too, he was looking forward to being back in church. He had it very high on his agenda to be back here as quickly as possible. He was looking for it. Those things are there to teach us. It's an example to show us the possibilities, the likelihoods, and how vulnerable individually we are. So God has given us these teachings, these understandings, not only to embolden our faith, but to help us to change the way in which we think and change the way we live, and to make ourselves ready and prepared at all times, no matter what is happening. This is a point I try to drive home at the feast. No matter what is happening, no matter what else is happening out there, your mind has to be constantly engaged. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. The mind must always be on God. You have to develop that habit, that ability to know that you can be as busy as a bee, but your mind is stayed on your master, on your Savior. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. The Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow after deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. I bet you said that couldn't happen to me. I bet you just said that to yourself. It's talking about those people. Talking about, yeah, I know, man, those kind of people, that's what will happen to them. What if I tell you that can happen to you? It's because you really have not yet seen some of the things that are ahead of us. But there's coming a time when the son of perdition, when the man of sin is going to be able to call fire out of heaven. Where is he calling fire from? Heaven. Who is it heaven? God. Of course you know there are many heavens, but a man able to call fire out of heaven? Come on, you don't ignore him. And he tells you that he can heal your mother who has been ailing, or he can heal your child who is so sick, and you must bring your child to him in order for him to look after the child. A powerful man like that, you're going to ignore? When you're in trouble and those kind of offers present themselves, it's a different matter. It's a different matter. I don't care how strong and how good you are. If you're not really, really strong, you're going to find, because you've been having this child for the longest while in such a condition, and you've been going to doctor, you've spent so much money and so on, and you hear that a man who can bring down fire out of heaven say if you come, he can heal your child? Thank you. Thank you. Free of cost. Free of cost. You don't know the circumstance yet. Many people who fall into trouble, it is not what, it is the circumstance that causes them to fall into it. It's the circumstances that cause them to fall into it. And when I see this in the scriptures, I am not a happy guy. I look at it and I say, you know what? It means that I gotta think about some more of the traps of the enemy and what he is planning to do with me and with you. So the answer to all of this comes in a few texts here that I have quoted. The Apostle Paul speaking to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 to 7, he says, the time has come for my departure. That means he feels he's going to die now. I've fought a good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. But the same apostle would go a little further. He would say, I have not yet taken hold of it. There is a way in which you can be in the race and you have fought the fight and you are pretty much there, but you have not yet taken hold of it. So I cannot take too much comfort
not yet.
in the fact that I'm close to the milepost.
That's good.
I need to press on, leaving everything behind and moving towards the goal in order to take on. Yeah. There is an attitude that we need in order to make a success of our Christian walk. And it is this kind of an attitude where we never see ourselves as having hold of it. We always see ourselves as having to press on and moving towards the mark because it's there. Hebrews 12:2. So how do you do that? Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. Same thing that we keep in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Fixing your eyes on Jesus is one of the prerequisites for being ready, making yourself ready. I don't know who. I may be talking to myself. But I know that the idea of being ready is not something that is an easy thing. I may have good ideas, I may have good hopes, I may have good ambition, I may be thinking in that direction. But being ready is a different matter. Being ready is to do the things like what the people who came from the feast did. They say, you know what? Oh, I'm just going from the feast, I'm going to put on some fasting. I'm going to put on some fasting. I want now for God to work out his purpose in me. And I want to avail myself to him. And therefore I'm going to empty myself in order to make myself available to God that he can accomplish his will in me. And that is a journey that we have to walk individually. I can't walk it for you. You can't walk it for me. Each one of us is going to have to take that on and walk. So let us turn and close in the book of James, in James 5. The attitude thing, verses 7 to 12. And before I'm through with this, as I'm closing, I just want to ask the speakers right after service, just, after you take a little break and get some refreshments, we want to have a meeting in the room here in order to go through some important work. James 5:7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The haste for saying, Christ is not coming right now and I have a few things to do, let me hurry up and do them, is not the way. The thing is to understand that the coming of the Lord is in his own time. My death is going to be in God's own time. And therefore, I'm going to have to be patient about it. The patience is paralleled, is the example of it. It says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. Interestingly, the early and latter rain here refers to the feasts of God too. Okay? It refers to the early festivals and it refers to the latter festivals. So this farmer example is very, very appropriate here. You also be patient. So how do you do it? It says, establish your hearts. That establish your hearts remind me of, it says, it's like a man planted by the waters, where the root goes down, like a tree planted close to the rivers of waters, and the root goes down, so that your root is deep. Established means building roots. Building roots. A person who is just going to be simply living the life and they are just on the surface, they're just, peripheral in their Christian walk, is going to run into trouble. This thing calls for roots, strong roots. It calls for strong roots like when hurricane coming. And if you don't grow the root, if you don't grow the spiritual roots, you're going to find that you're easily rooted up and tossed by wind. And so this is important. Verse 8. You also be patient. Establish your hearts. For the coming of the Lord is at hand. The coming of the Lord is at hand. And whilst we understand that, we also say the coming of my death is at hand. Let us face it anyhow. It is more likely for one to die before the coming of Christ. Based on what we know in prophecy. Because prophecy teaches us and tells us that there are certain things that must happen before Christ comes. So we don't have to, we're not even in the guess game. We have a better feel for this. And so I must more look towards preparing myself in order to make myself secure that when I go, I am in a condition that when the first resurrection comes, I will be part of it. Do not grumble against one another. Oh, really? Really? Don't grumble against one another? But that sounds like something that happens very often, very frequent. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Really? You mean just grumbling cause condemned? We would think that doesn't. But the scriptures are making it, and it also talks about grumbling against God too. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, like the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. This is how you are to express your suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. Because we are good, we're good at looking at people in the Olympics. And we can praise them and say, boy, how these people are doing well, and they perform, and great, and we admire them, and we talk about them, and we see their pictures put up all over the place and so on. And we ourselves commend them. Really? Well, do you know that the Christian life is an Olympian kind of walk? It takes the kind of discipline, it takes the kind of courage, it takes the kind of sacrifice. It does. So when it says here, indeed, we count them blessed who endure. So why, if we are counting them blessed, why don't we endure? Why don't we make it our business to endure? You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord. You've seen that. That the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Meaning you have examples. That's what it's saying. You and I have examples. We don't have to guess. We have examples, living examples that of people who have lived and lived up to the standard and have made it. There's no excuse for you. There's no excuse for me. But above all, my brethren, it says, do not swear either by heaven or by earth with any other oath, but let your yea be yea, let your nay be nay, lest you fall into judgment. As I leave and I go back to a far distant land in a few days, I want to not only commend you for keeping and standing, but I also want to encourage you. I want to encourage you to deepen your route, to make it your business, make it your plan, find some way. And if you don't know how to do it, talk to a good brother or a good sister who you see is doing very well in their walk. Talk to one of the deacons, talk to one of the elders in training, talk with one of the members that you see have that kind of attitude. Because if you and I don't take on this in a very serious way, then condemnation and judgment, and what a waste it is. After being in church for so long, after making so much sacrifices, I am no better than the man who was breaking Sabbath. Yeah. I'm no better than the person who was not keeping feast days. I'm just, because I just did not make the best use of what God has given me. May God encourage your hearts, and may you be obedient to Him. Amen.